So this is the neoclassical lecture. Neoclassical started about 1750. I put 1900 as the end date because there were some stick in the muds who didn't want to change when everything else was like becoming impressionist and cool. There are still those that said, no, we like it the old-fashioned way. But neoclassical is very much old-fashioned. So the word neo means new, and classical means classical. So this is basically, we talk about classic art of Greece and Rome. The neoclassical is the new classical, where they basically went back to Greece and Rome, and they tried to copy that type of art. So, characteristics of neoclassicism. So, you had this reaction. People saw the Baroque and they saw the Rococo and they said, oh, that is just way too much fluff, too many putti flying around over my head. We need to have something clean and straight. And so there's a clean and linear style. And the forms of the people are often posed and sculptured. So if you think of Rubens' Daniel in the Lion's Den, or you think of St. Peter letting Jesus down by his teeth, yeah, that thing would never happen in neoclassical. They want someone who's standing there posed like a Greek sculpture. And so they would take their themes from classical antiquity. So it wouldn't be necessarily modern things. You wouldn't have, I'm trying to think of what these Renaissance pictures of, you know, modern popes and that sort of thing. No, you want a good classical sculpture. And it reflected the natural laws of science, politics, and society. So this is during what we call the Enlightenment. And so science was becoming a big thing. And the Baroque and the Rococo applied to emotion. This is where the Catholic Church was trying to say, you know, come back to us. We're cool. We have bright, colorful paintings of lots of little winged babies flying around. And the neoclassical said, no, I want art that hits me in the mind, that I can think about. And so there's the big differences between the Baroque and the Rococo and the neoclassical. So this is very cerebral, very thinking type stuff. Looking back to the old days, you want straight lines, you want nice, clean colors. So because we have been occupied in 20th century sort of things, we never actually got to talk about the Enlightenment in this class. Usually we would have spent a while and learned all about these folk, scientific revolution and Enlightenment, but sort of to summarize. So Enlightenment means the getting light. So the idea of coming out of the dark of the Middle Ages, of superstition, into the light of reason and science. So I can split it down into 3 sections. So here we have an entire unit of freshman history in one slide. So rationalism. This is the idea that people can use reason to gain knowledge. And you may look at that and say, well, this is, well, duh, that's how you gain knowledge unless you're sitting at a computer and your teacher is speaking to you. But that you learn things by thinking about them. And this was actually a relatively new concept that, oh, I can examine stuff and I can figure it out, which relates to empiricism, which is a big word, just meaning that we can learn from what we see. That if we want to figure out how something works, we look at how it works. And this was, again, this is something that we think, well, of course. But the idea of actually doing a science experiment was totally unknown before the Enlightenment. And so this is when you got the idea, people would say, well, tadpoles are made because basically, you know, leaves fall into the pond in the fall, and over the winter, the leaves turn into tadpoles, and that's where you get tadpoles from. no one had ever actually bothered to sit down and check if that's what happened. And finally, progressivism, that mankind will just keep getting better and smarter, and we will make progress. And this actually lasted until World War I, when people realized, oh, maybe we aren't. But that's not what we're going to talk about now. Enlightenment is the time when the scientific revolution, you had philosophy, all that sort of stuff. And we've seen this painting before. So he was a bit ahead of his time, 1640s, so like 60 years before the neoclassical really took off. And we mentioned this a little bit. So again, notice as we talk about the characteristics of what is neoclassical art, you have these posed people. So this could be a Greek sculpture. This could be a Greek sculpture. You have the straight lines. You have lots of horizontals and verticals. So you have these horizontals, you have these verticals, this vertical here, you have the landscape basically horizontal. And so this was done during the Baroque time, but it's very much got the characteristics of neoclassical. Right, so here is a good neoclassical picture. Now compare this to if this were a Baroque picture. Think of how Rubens would have painted the stonemason's yard. Basically, it's a place where the guy who works with stones, here he is here, cutting one, is measuring and cutting these stones for building projects. Rubens might have had a teetering pile of stones and the guy working underneath there with little bits falling and this cat running around or whatever. But no, this is very much, you have this strong horizontal line of the river. You have this strong vertical lines going here. You have almost half of the painting with nothing happening in it. And so this is a good example of what the neoclassical person liked. Plus the fact he's dealing with stone. This is like the old-fashioned thing. This is the true building material of those great Greeks and Romans. So here's a Swiss painter who actually moved to Britain. And the title of this just gives it all away. So the artist moved to despair by the grandeur of antique fragments. These artists would see the things that the ancients had built. And all that remains is little ruins or fragments. And they could look at the ruins of the Colosseum in Basel. And back then it would have been overgrown with trees, and they'd say, wow, this once was great. Boy, the Middle Ages sure were dark. And it became the fashion to take a grand tour. So there's, at the moment, there's an Amazon Prime series called The Grand Tour, which, yeah, is nowhere near as good as Top Gear used to be. But they get their name from this idea that the wealthy young aristocrats, people who were gonna eventually be the ones to be running society, would take a year or two or three, depending on how much money they had, and they would tour around the cultural highlight spots of Europe. So Paris was definitely a spot where they would stop, brush up on their French. They would pick up a tutor because French was the language of everyone back then, kind of like English is the language today. And then they would then come to this area, to Basel or Lucerne or Geneva, and they would then spend some time here. Then they would cross over the Alps. They would go to Venice and Florence and Rome, and basically soaking in the ancient culture and learning about, these, in Britain, oh, goodness sakes, we eat our peas with a knife. We need to learn how to be proper culture. And so the idea was these young gentlemen who had no problems with money would go around basically learning about art and culture. And after spending a year or so in Italy, they would work their way back through the German side, and Heidelberg was often a popular spot, Heidelberg, Berlin, Munich, and learn about German philosophers and such until they returned back to Europe or back to Britain, prepared to take over the roles of leadership. So in a way, it was kind of like what we do today in college, except you have PowerPoints instead of actually going visit them. So you guys are kind of at an advantage that you live in a place where BFA can actually take field trips to spots that were on the Grand Tour. And in the process of this Grand Tour, they would absorb a lot of the ideas from classical antiquity. Now someone, I think it was Emma Akira, wrote and said, well, who are some of your favorite artists? And this is one of my favorite artists. So let me find where I put all my notes on here. So an experiment on a bird in an air pump. And this is chiaroscuro, but the topic is very much Enlightenment. It's very much neoclassical. So even though the style uses something that Caravaggio did 100 years ago, he's now taken this style and he has moved it on to dealing with scientific inquiry. We have the scientist here. And give a little explanation. So this is a bird, a pigeon or a dove of some sort. And this contraption here sucks the air out of this globe. And so in this experiment, they're showing what happens when you basically take the air away from a bird. And you can see it's kind of flapping about in desperation. And as we go through around the people here, it's interesting to look at the expressions. Okay, so over here, you have these two girls, and the father is explaining. So he is teaching. This is reason. Ah, observe, my dear daughters. This bird is now being starved of oxygen. 1768, they hadn't quite named oxygen yet. But this bird then needs air to breathe. And of course, this one, it's like, oh, I can't look. This one is, I shouldn't look, but yeah, what is happening up there? And you have an older man here who is carefully taking notes. So he is there to learn. He's carefully taking notes. Ah, yes, the bird did this, took 18 seconds or whatever. And these two are just watching fascinated. These two, yeah, they're not overly interested in science at the moment. And this is the part that I find quite intriguing. Here you have an assistant, and he is either putting away the cage, which means the bird is toast, let air back in and let the bird continue to live. So yeah, we don't know whether he's putting the cage away or taking down the cage. But what makes this a work of neoclassicism all, this isn't Matthew being called, this is science as a topic of worthy of a painting. And now in our art class, we'll go through quite a bit of Gainsborough and these British artists, but we're just going to do one from him here. And this one is sort of the result of a competition that the two biggest portrait landscape painters of Britain at that point had with each other. The other guy's name was Joshua Reynolds, and Reynolds had said something to the extent of, you know what, it really is impossible to paint a good portrait using cool colors. You need to use warm colors. Anything cool is just going to be awful. And so Gainsborough took this as a challenge and said, oh yeah? And so he painted the entire boy wearing blue as a challenge to his rival Reynolds to say, look, I can make a good portrait using nothing but cool colors. And of course, this was happening at the time of the neoclassical, but the interesting thing about it is that here you have a scientific approach toward color theory. That they are recognizing these colors have certain effects, and that if you use colors in this way or you use colors in this way, we will now try to examine what is the science behind the perception of color. All right, some of you might end up taking Canadian history, and this is hanging in the Parliament building in Canada, The Death of General Wolfe. And the story is, well, it's actually a true story in this case, is that you have a fort, today we call it Quebec, and it was French. And the British come in and they want to conquer Canada, so they take Quebec, and on the battlefield, General Wolfe, who's leading the British, is fatally shot. But his group win, and the British end up taking Canada, which is why BFA speaks English and not French. So because of this guy, that you English speakers are here at the school. So let's see, what did I have notes about this one? Okay, no particular notes. And what the neoclassical elements here, okay, first of all, you have Wolfe dying. And it's a very much a posed picture because this isn't actually what it looked like. But you have here this heroic person, and in the time, as we talk about the Enlightenment, you have the whole concept of how the state and the person should relate to each other. And unfortunately, we haven't had that much time to go over what all the Enlightenment was about. But here you have a hero of the country who has now taken over, and in the background you can see Quebec City, and this will now all be part of Britain. And here you have a representative of the native people of Canada that are watching, representatives of the different groups of the British, and looking on as this great hero of the country expires. Now, this next one, you might have heard of the architect. We haven't done too much about architecture, but this guy's famous, fairly famous, considering he was president of the United States for a while. And this was on the back of the nickel, the US nickel, for a long time. Thomas Jefferson actually designed this building. It's called Monticello. And notice the way that he designed it. Think back to those Baroque churches with their curvy fronts and pediments that are split up into different bits. And now we have just a straight, clean pediment. It's not even filled with stuff, it's just nice and blank. You have columns, very simple columns in the first order. You have all the brick, which basically makes horizontal and vertical lines of the columns. This is very much not a Baroque building. So this was built by Thomas Jefferson, who was very much a scientist, very much one who was interested in the whole idea of the Enlightenment. And I hope at some point you guys can actually get a class that explains a little bit more about what the Enlightenment was. During this time, there were huge changes going on in society. So we have something called the Industrial Revolution. Again, we would used to spend an entire unit on this one slide. It started in Great Britain, and you could basically sum up the Industrial Revolution as saying the rise of the factory, the rise of mass production. Before this time, everything you got had to be made individually, which means it was a lot more expensive. With mass production, products became a lot cheaper. Now, it also had an effect on the workers. So even today, you talk about, oh yeah, Walmart is so cheap, but then you have, well, what about the poor Walmart workers? Same thing happened here. You had mass production, you had factories, the price of products went way down, but you also had overcrowding in the cities. You had like Oliver Twist and A Christmas Carol written in this time period. The other main thing that you guys should know from this is that this is a rise of steam power. We had the rise of the factory, mass production, cheaper goods, and the rise of steam power. This was a picture of the first train that served a regular service between two cities. And so this is what the early trains look like. As you can imagine, it's not overly going fast because all the hats are still on the heads. And this gives us this great piece of, you could say, art, definitely an important piece of architecture. It is called Iron Bridge because it was the first bridge to be made entirely out of iron. Up until that point, bridges were either wood or stone. And so now this is a symbol of the Industrial Revolution, a symbol of this whole new era where you're able to actually build an entire bridge out of iron. And it is 140 some years old, 141 years old, 241 years old. And it is still there today. You can't drive over it anymore for the past, I think since about 2000 or so, you can't drive over it, but you can still walk over it. All right, back to paintings. One of my absolute favorites. So we are now talking about Jacques-Louis David. He is the poster child of the neoclassical. And one of the reasons that we don't have that many paintings that you guys have to know is because it was pretty much David and his friends in the neoclassical. So this is a story. Yeah, let's see, we have someone who may not be in our class trying to get in here. So this is a story of a group, two families that are called the Harashi and the Kurati. And they offended each other, people were upset, and basically these brothers here are swearing to their father that they will now go to war and they will not come back unless they have killed their enemies. So basically we'll either come back with our shield or on it. So these over here are their sisters and wives. There's their mom. And the problem here is that one of these is a sister of the ones they're going to fight. And she is married to one of these. The other one is married to the people they're going to fight and is the sister of one of these. So these ladies over here know that they will either lose their husband or lose their brother. And so in this oath, they're swearing to the father, we will kill them or be killed. But look at the structure. So very much not Baroque. So you have the straight columns taken from Greek architecture. You have the floor done all in horizontals. They could just simply be paintings of sculptures, including these. The background, nothing going on, just plain dark and black. Death of Socrates. So Socrates was a philosopher and, oh, my computer is complaining. So Socrates was a philosopher. He was accused for political reasons of corrupting the youth and sentenced to die. And he chose to die by giving his last lecture to his pupils, and he prepares to drink the poison. So again, we have a story from ancient times, not a myth. It's an actual story of a person who was there. And notice the style. The background is lots of horizontals, a Romanesque arch, nothing Gothic here. This is old Rome style. You have a group of people that are basically just posed. They could be carved out of stone. And there's none of this wrap myself up in prayer type Daniel stuff. Like one guy is just simply ball on the people. There's no burst of wind flapping it about and having it come off here. So this one is pretty clear to see that this is a neoclassical painting. Your book mentioned Vigée Laboon, a painting of Marie Antoinette and her kids. She's the famous one who got several paintings of her, and just sort of threw this one in as an example, a fairly straightforward composition. The portraits are not, there's not as much difference between neoclassical and Baroque portraiture, because part of the point is simply to show what the person looks like. All right, again, you're recognizing a theme here. So this is David, and in this story, this is another story from the founding of ancient Rome, and this is a fellow by the name of Brutus, and lictors are like the leaders in the country, or back the bodies of his sons. So what had happened in this, the story is the early days in the Roman Republic before the empire, and one of the leaders, so he's a leader in the Republic, had two sons who revolted against the Republic and wanted to bring back a king. And the leaders said, you know what, you have committed treason, therefore you must be sentenced to death. Even though they were his own sons, he was willing to sacrifice his own sons for the sake of the French Revolution. And again, we haven't talked about the French Revolution, but for those of you who know it, it's when the French overthrew their king and the sacrifice of your own family to have a republic instead of king. And the straight up and down lines, we have classical columns, a straight line. Brutus is sitting there in this pose. Even mom, there's emotion happening there, but it's more like a Hellenist posing, mourning the fact that her sons have been killed and comforting her remaining children here. Okay, this one was in your book, and the book talked a bit about the structure of the painting. I'm going to tell a little bit more about the background of the painting. So Marat was one of the leaders of the French Revolution. 1793, they have already had the revolution. France is being governed by the revolutionary government, and Marat had a skin disorder, so he would basically spend his day in a bathtub, kind of like an oatmeal bath to make him feel better, and he would actually conduct business. So he had a little desk set up and such, and this lady, you know what, we need to have the king back. You know, that was her feeling. These people are awful. They're doing nothing but chopping people's heads off with the guillotines. And so she said, I have a list of people who are traitors to the republic. So you can, you know, sit in the waiting room here and then you'll get a chance. So she comes in with this list and hands it to him. And when he looks at it, she takes her knife, which is right here, and she stabs it in his chest, whereupon he then expires. And she is, of course, arrested. She's brought to the guillotine and she's executed. But she says, I did it for France. And Marat was very much a person who was of the opinion that we should bring more people to the doubt that the way that he actually died would have been, there would have been the papers, you know, he wouldn't be still holding his paper and holding his pen, of nothing up here. You have the straight lines, a nice, smoothly covered board. The straight lines of his little grass.
Just to warn you, you are getting a little
question.
too glitchy.
Okay. So, let me see. I'll turn off your password stuff. And I think all the rest of that is Zoom things that you can't really do. Okay, is that any better? Probably not.
Oh, for me it is actually.
Okay, good.
A little.
All right, here's another neoclassical building. You might recognize it. Around this time, you know, late 1700s, is when a lot of these government type buildings were being built, and this became very much the style. So if you look at countries that built their capitals in the 1800s or in the late 1700s in this case, they will often have columns. Even if like that, it'll often be built in this sort of neoclassical style. And if places that are more modern, like the capital of Brazil is done in this wild 1970s sort of thing, but this became sort of like, if it is a government building, it has to have columns to the neoclassical times. And it's been added onto. So you have the different wings. I'm not sure which direction this faces, but one of them is the famous West Wing. These are all added later, but they kept to the same style. Another very American thing. So this is the most reproduced painting in the world. Can anyone make a guess as to why this would be the most reproduced painting in the world? Yep, because it's on the $1 bill. And so since the US makes billions of these things, it's been reproduced many, many times. And the interesting story about this is that the painter never actually finished it. He got this far and it became so popular that people kept asking for copies, and he made over 75 paintings that were copied off of this one, but he never actually finished the original. So he got far enough to typical style, no background figuring whatsoever, nary apputo to king out, the calm expression on his face. So speaking of propaganda, when we talk about the neoclassical, and Napoleon wanted the stone, which led into this whole scientific advances, but militarily it was a bit of a disaster. And Napoleon actually had to leave his army in Egypt and come back to France. And of course, his political opponents and such would say, you abandoned this army in Egypt, you left them there to die. And this painting was sort of commissioned as a propaganda piece, which is today in Israel. And they were basically in quarantine. And Napoleon said, would you paint me a painting of me visiting my poor plague-ridden soldiers to show how caring I am, to show how unafraid of the plague I am. And so, of course, they painted him. Whether or not he was ever actually visited the plague people in Jaffa, we don't know. We kind of think he didn't. So this was a pure act of propaganda. Very much columns. You have this Middle Eastern flair. I wanted to throw that in there a bit. And just for those of you who might have heard the rumors, Napoleon was really short. He wasn't actually short. The French and the British have a different way of measuring inches back then. And so Napoleon was actually average height. And here he is again. Another huge propaganda piece. And if you get a chance to go to the Louvre, take a look at this one. It is massive. And this is the coronation of Napoleon. Actually, Napoleon is already crowned. What he is doing here is he is crowning his wife Josephine as Empress of France. Did all this sort of stuff, eventually became the first consul, then he became first consul for life, and then he eventually said, yeah, we'll just make myself ruler of the world, and became the emperor of France. And as he just sort of